Mark. Hey, Mark. Thank you for joining us from Nairobi. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We thought we would add this little dramatic moment to talk about the digital age around the world, and so Mark is perfect for this. So let me start out. You know, when we think about how the things we've been discussing today, the omnipresence in some places in the world of digital opportunity and digital connection. Mark, I want to, you are so responsible. You're creating user experiences throughout Africa, and you are, one of the great entrepreneurs in this area. What do you think you want us to know in the so-called West, I say the West carefully here, that are the biggest misconceptions we have about your world?
Yeah, there is a role that culture nuances, and that's one of the things that people don't particularly realize. So we always think that we can export wholesale experiences because they work in the West and because they seem to connect with people in the West, and then basically coming export them to this side of the world without proper consideration and creating or holding space for empathy so that we understand how these things disrupt or affect day-to-day lives of people. Like this morning, I was in Michaelanne, deep in Michaelanne. I went there from 4 a.m. to actually try to understand how the introduction of this medium to a community that previously didn't have it, how that affects their day-to-day life, and what's the most sensitive way to actually see how to engage. So creating that space for contextual and cultural nuance is one of the things that I think is highly underrepresented in crafting experiences like this for different contexts.
What are the biggest problems you've had in trying to get people online? Because I know that, when we think about culture, and I know that our friends Michaelanne and Ramesh, they've been all around the world. Michaelanne in Cuba recently, Ramesh everywhere else, it seems, except perhaps in Kenya. But I'm just interested, as you've approached this, just getting people online. And we've been talking today about, earlier today we were talking with someone about habits and even addiction to the internet. And I suppose that you would love to get to the point where people have that much access that they could get addicted to something. But how do you solve some of the speed bumps in bringing communities online?
Yeah, I think even the onboarding of people onto the internet, traditional onboarding practice, for instance, if you say here's an SSID and a password, you would think that's straightforward enough. And then when you try and deconstruct that or communicate that to different people, you find that they have some dissonance with this paradigm of thinking. And then some of the things we've been doing, for example, is trying to align day-to-day behavior with or day-to-day language or communication into how we onboard people. But also that idea of what does it also mean to be online. For example, if I am a pastoralist, today I was talking to pastoralists, what does it mean to be online for a pastoralist? And these are questions that, and what kind of information, for example, are they looking for when they're going online? And how do we make that available to them much faster? So can we create, for instance, caching for specific information that is at the edge of the grid? And that's why we're building, for instance, trying to think about the internet in different ways instead of the infrastructure that exists in the West, where you send a request to a server and everything flows back in, and you don't think about the fact that there are places where that infrastructure does not exist. How do we create an infrastructure that allows for that information to reach them in a way that respects their context or is sensitive to their context as well? So you have both communication considerations, also infrastructure considerations, and cultural considerations, and all these come into play in how we try and craft these experiences.
Michaelanne, I wonder if you might respond to how Mark is dealing with both access and bringing everyone together in another place, Cuba. I mean, which I don't know how many of you have been to Havana lately or been to Cuba. I've been a couple of times before really a lot of the so-called liberalization of at least some access in this. But I'm interested in, again, this question of what are our misperceptions? What are we not seeing that we should be seeing about these communities when they're coming online?
Right. So I think access in Cuba has been historically constrained, internet access. And while there is increase in access, so they've added public Wi-Fi hotspots recently, it is still prohibitive in terms of cost, in terms of speed. So people have to prioritize just what they can only get online, say, for an hour. And they're going to talk to their family. That's what they want to do, right? So they're not going online to explore, like, say, yeah, right.
They're not going to Expedia.
Right, they're not. They're not. They don't have time or resources to do this. So they've actually built their own information infrastructure. So they have an
wait. What does that mean? They built their own information infrastructure.
So, for example, they have this offline internet called El Paquete, which is 1 terabyte of digital content that's delivered weekly by hand. It's compiled in Cuba. And it includes content from all over the world, but also content that's local to Cuba that's been developed there. So it's a completely different way that you see the internet in other highly connected regions, and yet they have very fast access to not only entertainment, but education, content, and content that's being produced right there.
One of the things before I jump to Ramesh, I want to ask Mark and you, Michaelanne, is sometimes when, my pet peeve when we look at the world and the internet, and particularly communities that don't have as abundant bandwidth and they don't have as abundant connectivity, is I just hear most people looking at it as a philanthropy exercise, that they look at it through, oh, let's see what we can give, or it has a kind of, 19th century, oh, let's help our, brothers out here that do this. And I just find there's part of me that finds it so obnoxiously wrong. Can you help me articulate what's wrong with that formulation, if in fact it is? Because I do know that a lot of people who look at Africa look at it as a basket case, or they look at Cuba as a basket case where innovation is not happening and everything needs to be a handout. So as Rachel Maddow would say, talk me down. Mark?
I'll let Rachel go first.
Okay.
Well, that's a great question. I think, honestly, there's this perception that everything needs to be more connected, and that, we, or say people in Silicon Valley, in the West, need to come and introduce this. But, as you see in Cuba, there's already all these innovations that people have designed themselves, and they're locally appropriate. They're flexible. They're considerate of what people want and what people value. So instead of this top-down infrastructure coming in by outside corporations or governments that say, this is what we value and this is what we think you need, is there a way to make that so that other people, it's more participatory, so that other people are able to decide, so that maybe it doesn't look like how we conceive of it looking. Maybe it can look different. And I think the bottom question is who can participate, who gets to decide, who gets to make those choices.
Right. Mark?
Yeah, I think I actually resonate with a lot of what she just said, because, for instance, when we've come to certain communities and we've looked at models where we actually can get the communities to participate. For example, we have this microserver that we've built that indeed can cache content and people can consume content that is offline and can go to the internet. And we want the communities to participate in creating that content. For instance, we have a huge oral culture. So a lot of our history is passed down orally, sitting by the fire, the sage or your grandma or your grandpa telling all these tales. They've taken their mobile phones and recorded this, and now they're passing it across the community. For instance, if it is a local artist who doesn't have a voice on YouTube because basically they don't have enough followers, can we create hyperlocal networks where they upload their video, and based on how it trends within the hyperlocal network, then it gets escalated to a regional and a national platform. So creating a voice for them, so that content that is coming from the ground up and innovations that are coming from the ground up get the local visibility and the cultural visibility, or they get some sort of audience which is actually almost democratically or based on merit and merit from their local community, as opposed to us shoving it down their throats. So there are paradigms like that, where that space is created, where things can happen, but they can happen organically and culturally sensitively.
Right.
And that design paradigm is what I'm super interested in.
Right. That's so great you mentioned that. Ramesh, I mean, you wrote The Global Village. This is a great book, a journey into so many different communities. And I guess lurking in the back of my mind, I guess, is South Korea. And I say that because South Korea was an unbelievably poor nation. I was raised in Asia. I remember South Korea when it was really poor. And it is one of the greatest, richest, most connected places in the world. And so I'm just wondering, to come back to what I had just asked, are the technology, when you go see in non-Western places, how people are taking technology and connectivity, is there a leapfrog possibility there? Are there ways in which communities are going to propel themselves that we're just blind to, that we don't understand to somewhat that there are strengths and innovation out there that we're just not seeing?
Absolutely. So, when we think globally about the internet and new technology and mobile phones, there are a couple different factors we have to consider. First of all, the vast majority of people who are connected to the internet in the world have more different than similar experiences, right? So like what they're experiencing, who they're experiencing content with, their constraints are as different as they are similar. That said, it's important to note and how the strange moment that we inhabit, where billions of people across the world also happen to be connected to platforms that are created within a 30-mile radius of one another, mainly in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. So that means there are always going to be problematic issues in terms of what is seen, what is visible, how is content ordered, even the norms by which platforms are structured. So we have this term, right? There are a lot of terms that I believe the tech industry has taken really effective sort of hijacking of, and I don't mean that in a malicious sense, but I just mean there are terms that we use when we talk about new technology. Disruption, innovation is another, right? So who actually said that innovation has to be defined by Steve Jobs, or by a laboratory where you have seemingly, like here, the Media Lab, where you have seemingly infinite resources? I know because I was a former Media Labber and we had so many resources. Innovation can actually occur when people face constraints. When you have less, you gotta hustle. You gotta be resourceful. You gotta think about how you make and create value for yourself, your family, your society. I saw this in action with Mark in Kenya just about a month ago. These are, and I can give you numerous examples of this. People in Kenya, for example, or across East Africa, engage in something that's called jua kali, which means, did I say it correctly, Mark?
Yes.
See, you taught me, man. Which means hot sun in Swahili, right? So what's going on there? People literally on the street with a table, maybe a soldering gun or whatever, are rigging things up, right? They're taking what we might see as waste, what might fit an economic model of planned obsolescence that is built into Apple's logic and Monsanto's, by the way, and are actually recreating value through repairing technologies, extending the lifespan of technologies, and creating new forms of value through that which is discarded. And I think that's really, really beautiful to think about. And why does that happen? Not because they want to do that necessarily, but because you have no other choice. You have less constraints. So this is true across the ecosystem in terms of VC funding on the higher level, but on the level of like a street-based entrepreneur. And so Mark and I firsthand saw examples, you won't believe this, in Nairobi where people are creating 3D printers primarily, or at least partly, out of junk, out of e-waste, out of recycled parts, 3D printers. And these printers are way cheaper. They're creating parts that are useful for the local environment, and they're much more resilient because they're built within the local environment, right? So you see examples like this all over the world. My current field work in southern Mexico, I've been looking at the largest community-owned cell phone network in the world. Why was that network built? This is built by a number of indigenous communities in the Oaxaca area. Why did they build this network? Because they had no other choice, because the telecom providers wouldn't come there, and even Google and Facebook are not there. It's too infrastructurally disadvantaged in the sense that we're talking about people in CloudForce and so on. So they built their own GSM and daisy-chained it to voice over IP. So this is the idea. So one of the things that you see when you look across the world is everything from how we design to engineer, to own, to actually engage with technology can all be layered through the prism of place, context, environment, culture, and so on. And that actually, instead of seeing this as places that are at the bottom of the pyramid or new markets or this and that and the other,
right,
they actually are sites of new forms of innovation, new tops of new pyramids. And I think that that is really, really important. And actually that creates a lot of hopefulness as we think about the digital world and all these concerns that are being raised at meetings like this one.
Let me ask the three of you in just very short form, because I want to go to the audience and make sure we build that in. Where do other players fit into this story? So we've talked a lot about the individuals or people basically responding to the constraints and showing ingenuity and able to create hubs and intranets of their own and so on. But I'm interested in the role of governments too. I mean, and one of the things we're fighting and dealing with in the United States right now is essentially the question of anonymity and behavior and connectivity and even division in our society. And anonymity, many people feel, helps feed that in this country. And I go to other countries where people are living in illiberal places, and anonymity, or their perception of it, is what they think saves them. And I'm just interested, I don't know if anonymity is possible in Cuba, but is that an issue you folks think about and is think that the global village that you're out there talking about is thinking about it? Why don't we go to Mark first?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Exist in such I mean, in many ways, even if the place I want today, Masala, it encompasses a lot of this conversation, like what Ramesh was talking about,
right.
Literally our infrastructure, and then having to think about the idea of how, even for us as a company, how we even deal with people's data. I was talking to Ramesh quite extensively about this. Is that important? How do you even communicate the idea that for instance, you have these terms and conditions and things. When we are onboarding our users, there's ways we talk about terms and conditions in the West, as you call it, and talk about security and talk about privacy. And what about that is, how do you communicate that, for instance, to a person who is semi-literate, to a person who doesn't necessarily understand how the information is collected, what is stored, and how that is used.
Right.
And as a company and as a designer, what is my role in sort of making that crystal clear? Is there a way we can design that communication? Is there a way we can design that relationship and sensitivity, or in terms of the information that comes into our servers when we connect people across a huge network of public transport vehicles to free internet? What does that mean? What data do we collect? Why are we collecting it? What data do we store? How are we storing it? And how are we creating that a social contract between ourselves and a person who's hardly literate? Right. And having to design that is very, very important for me especially, and indeed for the company that I work with, trying to design very, very clear, understandable communication to these extreme user of our system, and having that social contract that we and faith that we have together, where we're saying we're gonna respect you, and we're gonna respect you in a way that is visible to you, right, and in a way that actually makes sense to you, and that's such an important design element in the work we do, and it's one of the things that honestly I travel from corner to corner of this continent trying to figure out.
Thank you. Real short form, Michaelanne and Ramesh.
I think I agree with what he said, and also especially considering when these platforms like Facebook and Twitter and others are being adopted across different geographies with different governments, there might be a need to have different terms of service or different types of the ways that they're going to use the data. It can't be one size fits all. You know, I think obviously different governments have different intentions.
Right.
And there's also different.
Well, we were talking about China in the green room, for instance.
Exactly,
you know, so.
Exactly. So I think, and users have different different concerns in different places. You know, we've talked so much about how making things locally appropriate. I think also with privacy, and that's especially not one size fits all.
Right.
So it's a very complicated thing, especially with, like you said, these services being designed, in 30-mile radius, and then the intentions to spread it around the world.
Ramesh? And that even goes down to Wikipedia content, which is 90+% edited by white males. So it's important to note that, right? And so I think in the Western world, we have this kind of tantalizing, yet also really troubling experience around questions of privacy. I mean, who are we private to? Well, we might be to one another, but not necessarily to the state, or obviously to the companies who have all our data. And I think it's important to think about that relationship of anonymity and privacy relative to place, right? In China, with Xi Jinping and the Silk Road Doctrine and all, they're fully signed on, whether they like it or not, to having their data not only widely available, but aggregated, right? Like the social credit scoring system. Some of you might know about that. Right. That Black Mirror episode was based on. But then you also see examples like Estonia. The New Yorker had a good article.
Don't jaywalk in Beijing.
In blockchain, right? Yeah, in some parts of China, if you jaywalk illegally, not only will that be linked to your social credit system, but that you'll also have your image projected on billboards near you. So this is like straight out of sci-fi, right? But in Estonia, we see examples with looking at blockchain. Not that it's the be-all, end-all, but these are ideas of essentially exerting territorial power over the infrastructures of technology.
Wow, fascinating. There's been a very quick just toe in the water on what's going on in the world, which we only could hope for just toe in the water, but thank you for putting us in the water. But let me open up questions and comments from others in the room, particularly those of you who have an international slant to what you're doing. I will pick one of you. You nodded, this gentleman in the front. You look, yeah. Any thoughts, reactions?
Thanks.
Well, you did nod, he nodded.
I may have nodded also, but I have a question.
Yeah.
So earlier in the day, we talked at different points about overuse and technology being difficult to resist.
Right.
And I know that there are access issues that would maybe make that irrelevant, but I'm curious if you're still seeing that start to just pop up in these regions with increased access.
So let me just quickly paraphrase for Mark, who may not have been able to hear that. Part of the question was the question of as you saw methodologies emerging that made it difficult to resist the internet or resist apps, and wondered if you were beginning to see this as the technology became more pervasive in some of the other parts of the global village. Mark, quick comment maybe?
Yeah, I think one of the most concerning ones I see is the culture of betting. One of the biggest companies is Sportspesa. It's now the shirt sponsor of Everton Football Club, which is in England. People don't even understand what pesa means. Pesa means money in Kenya, but they're flush with cash. They've introduced this culture where young people, even in areas as remote as the Maasai Land where I was today, where there's hardly any infrastructure, there's only 2G connectivity, but still I could go to places and find young people addicted to betting on the English Premier League or betting on other things online, which is another side of access. And so the question is, can we also amplify what is our own? Can we amplify what is, what can we also amplify other forms of access and other forms of information and other forms of engagement for young people? Because the only reason they're betting is because they have 2G connectivity. They can't load any page with meaningful content. And these people have optimized their betting platform so you can send an SMS. And so because they don't have access to faster connectivity, they basically take that as their first form of entertainment, where they get a congratulations message and mobile money is sent to their phone, or they can send it through mobile money. So we're trying to also see if, presented with other options, if these can help them see other forms of spending their time and money.
Michaelanne, thoughts on addictive habits in Cuba?
I mean, I think
Beyond cigars.
I think access is still really limited in terms of addicted to online content. People definitely want, Facebook is what people want to get access to for sure. But I don't think that it's pervasive enough for people to be able to be constantly hooked to their phones.
They're not just like, being told to click on the Castro page over and over and over again.
Right.
That was supposed to be a joke, but didn't go well. Ramesh?
Well, I think you see different kinds of examples, illustrations of this. So, obviously in places where there's less robust connectivity, again, what connectivity means can be as different as similar, right? And so in places where you see sort of less robust connectivity, you don't see necessarily as much evidence of this kind of distress and tech addiction sort of issues. But you do see that definitely in certain parts of the world, especially with WhatsApp use, and in places like India and so on. But I do want to mention that, again, with these constraints around the absence of connectivity, or even by providing more robust connectivity, it doesn't necessarily have to turn into this all of us, stuck in our phones and bubbles and being disoriented kind of situation that we've expressed concern about today. It doesn't have to be that way. Mark works for an organization that I'm writing about in my new book. Not only is he a badass designer, but he works for an organization that's trying to provide free solar-powered connectivity, including intranet connectivity, cached content, to people across Kenya and Rwanda and other parts of the world, hopefully in East Africa, that is actually based upon giving people connectivity while they're in vans with 20 or 30 other people in them, right?
Wow.
Which is a very different idea than that connectivity is an individual-centric phenomenon. It's the idea that connectivity within the social space of the collective van could actually create and augment that experience. And they know, looking at their data, that what people look at when they have connectivity is they look at local content. They're not going online to look at stuff, about Trump or the United States or whatever. They're going online to look at and support businesses and the ecosystem that is local. So there's a lot of promise and potential when we see these examples in action.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all three of you. Mark Kamau, thank you for staying up so late in Kenya. Mark Kamau of UX Africa, Michaelanne Dye of Georgia Tech, and of course, Ramesh Srinivasan of UCLA. And go buy his book, The Global Village. It's so great. So thank you all very much.